So, handling hints and tips. This is where I start the meat of the command day, because the question that I pose to the group is, do they realise that as soon as the training captain has climbed out of the right hand seat and been properly substituted by a genuine co-pilot, you have become a training captain? Why is that? Well, because the operations manual requires it. It says that you shall develop your co-pilots. And if you think about the good captains that you have flown alongside, then those captains that have helped develop your skills when you were in the right-hand seat are indeed a model for you now that you're in the left-hand seat. But it seems to me to beg the question that it's quite useful to have some ideas about what you might compare the operation that you are seeing, if you like, in your co-pilots to what the norm should be on the aeroplane type that you're flying. And so the best place I find to start is with the approach and landing, because we know that from the very first time we climbed into an aeroplane, we learned that a good landing comes from a good approach. And for good on a heavy jet landing or heavy jet aeroplane, I mean a landing in the right place at the right speed with the wings level. And for a good approach, of course, I mean a stabilized approach. A stabilized approach. So if we think of a 747-400 for a moment, on approach, I would like us to imagine this is the slope and that is 1,000 feet, because and with apologies to those of you that have come across this in your conversion training, nevertheless it gives me quite a useful hook to develop one or two aspects. So if we think about our aeroplane, we're going to learn about landing by numbers, something that was introduced to me 35 years ago on the 747. It's good today as it is now, because if the aeroplane is stabilized, and let's say we were going to land with the flaps at 25, then the speed would be at VREF plus 5. The power would be about 1.15 if we were on a standard aeroplane at a standard day for a sea-level airport. The rate of descent would be about 800 feet a minute, and indeed the attitude, the all-important attitude, would be sitting at 3 degrees, which looks a bit like that on the PFD with the box, on a modern PFD sitting on the 2.5 degrees line. Now, if that were to be the case at 1,000 feet, then to all intents and purposes, in order to deliver a stabilized approach, the aeroplane only needs to be caressed around those numbers. And that will remain the case. It will remain the case until we get to the next number, which is 200 feet. At 200 feet, the 747-400 will always fly into ground effect. Ground effect will mean that unless the aeroplane is resisted, it will come off the glide slope. It is no rocket science whatever that the landing scatter on the 747 is predominantly deep. And the reason is that at 200 feet, or thereabouts, depending on the conditions of the day, but for our purposes, a standard aeroplane, standard day, sea level, 200 feet, the aeroplane will fly above the glide slope as it comes into ground. And it has to be resisted. It is resisted not by a huge trim forward, or by a push down, but it is resisted so that the aeroplane stays on the glide slope. And the next number that I've concerned with is 100 feet, because 100 feet is cool, as indeed is 1,000. 100 feet is cool, and at 100 feet the aeroplane needs to be in a position when you look out of the window there is some grass between you and the threshold. If there's lots of grass, you're dangerously low. If there's no grass, you're high. And basically this is what I would call the last chance saloon for you to make any slight, emphasis slight, adjustments because of your inability to keep on the slight glide slope when you flew into ground effect. The next number is of course 50 feet, also called 50 feet. At 50 feet the aeroplane must be over the threshold. Now, in my high-tech studio here in France, you will see I have a prop, and the prop is a model 747, and if you can imagine the aeroplane sitting at 3 degrees nose up, like that, then at 50 feet I'm going to ask the question, can you see the threshold? And of course with the nose shape like that, the aeroplane set up, the answer has to be no. So at 50 feet you need to be over the threshold, which means that you cannot see it. If you can see it, you're low, dangerously low, and you must go round. Simple as that. 50 feet over the threshold, you cannot see it. And the flare for an aeroplane, standard weight, standard day, sea level, starts at 30 feet. Not 29 feet, not 31 feet, at 30 feet. And the flare starts at 30 feet and is a question of pitching the aircraft about 2 degrees up and holding it until the wheels touch. "30 feet is highly speed critical. And so I'd just like to divert for a moment to a discussion. Okay, that's how to land a 747-400. If I were to say to you that the majority of heavy jet landings are done in good weather and flown manually, I don't think you'd have any problem agreeing with that at all. The vast majority of heavy jet landings are done manually in good weather. If I were to say to you that essentially, up until the flare, the approach on a heavy jet is an instrument flying activity, amongst the classroom there'll be some puzzled looks. And what I'm going to say to you is that if I covered up the PFD so you couldn't see the speed, and if I covered up the ICAS so you couldn't see the power, the ability to deliver a stabilised 3-degree approach is nigh impossible. And if you don't believe me, try it on the simulator. Because you can't hear power on a modern high technology airplane, you've got to see it. And of course you need to be able to see your speed and attitude in order to create that bit of stabilised approach. Now the interesting thing is that if you are prepared to agree with me on that, then you will come to my conclusion that the approach is essentially an instrument flying activity, but it is an instrument flying activity at a time when we've got the most distraction because we've got to land on the runway. And herein lies an issue. Again, no surprise to me that we get a disproportionate number of heavy landings on the 747-400. Why? Because the flare is absolutely speed dependent. If you are VREF plus 15 and you flare at 30 feet, you'll land 3,000 or 4,000 feet down the runway. If you're VREF or VREF minus a bit and you flare at 30 feet, the aeroplane will drop out of the sky in space. So it is very, very important you can see your speed as you enter the flare. And that requires your ability, genuine ability, to fly on instruments. And herein lies a very, very important aspect. And all that I'm going to say is this, that instrument flying is a perishable skill. All of us who've got any experience in flying aeroplanes know that. The first thing that goes when you're out of practice is your ability to fly accurately on instruments. Somebody who doesn't do that routinely is obvious to me within 30 seconds in a simulator. We'll fly a circuit and it will be ragged, or we'll fly an ILS, it will be ragged. Come round again, the second one will be better, the third one will be on the button. That is how we as pilots seem to, I don't know, we keep the ability up here, but somehow it needs to be brought forward into day-to-day activity in order for it to be delivered to a high standard. If it's a perishable skill, and if you need it, means to say, in my simple terms, and you'll learn about throughout this presentation that I am just a simpleton. I need to keep things really simple in order to be effective as an airline pilot, as an airline captain, and indeed as a trainer. If it's perishable, I need to practice it. And I need to practice it regularly. And once every 6 months in the simulator is not regular. Therefore, I shall tell you what I do. On 19 departures out of 20 that I fly, I will fly manually to 20,000 feet. On 8 out of 10 approaches, at least on the intermediate approach, I will hand fly those. And the reason I'm doing it, well, do I like it? Yes, I do like it. I'm a pilot. But most importantly, I'm doing it to practice my instrument flying skills. You must understand absolutely that I will never ever encourage hand flying when it is inappropriate to do so. At any time when there's workload increased, when perhaps we are manoeuvring around thunderstorms, would be a good example. On what would otherwise be a simple departure, the autopilot goes in immediately. Similarly, if on approach it is obvious that my co-pilot is beginning to get stressed or under showing evidence that he's under increased workload, the autopilot will go in. If I'm getting stressed or under increased workload, the autopilot will go in. The autopilot has got an on and an off switch. But the very basis of what I do day in and day out, which means landing the aeroplane manually in good weather, requires instrument flying skills. And the instrument flying skills are not practiced if I knock out the autopilot 800 feet and just try and keep everything as is for as long as possible before I do that and land it. Now, what you do to keep your skills to a high enough level that you are never found wanting in handling the aeroplane, should you need to, is down to you. But I want you to at least think about your responsibility in keeping those skills intact, just in case, one, the aeroplane presents itself in a situation, if you like, that you do not expect. And if you like, we could consider any number of the serious incidents that we have faced on 747-400 and other fleets, where the pilots were faced with an airplane that they didn't really expect to get in an attitude or a condition, and they were forced to correct the position manually. And you can only do that if you're in practice. Secondly, I am absolutely convinced, and nobody will ever talk me out of it, that the best operators of aeroplanes, are those who have got good manual flying skills. If someone is going to practice hand flying for the first time in 6 months because he's got his simulator check next Tuesday, well, we're living on different planets. Because my view is that you should always be in practice just in case you're required to use the skills which enabled you to get to the position you're in today. Those pilots who think they are computer operators first and pilots second may never ever get to do the second thing. You are always pilot first, computer operator second. The autopilot's put on board to serve you, not the other way round. And it's got an on and an off switch. And in summary, I want you to go back to the position that I am never, ever, ever going to suggest that you hand fly the aeroplane when it is inappropriate to do so. But I am going to request that you understand that you must keep, as part of your portfolio of skills, the ability to fly the aeroplane should you need to. And that requires consistent practice. Stabilised approach. So let's take this on and develop some thoughts about stabilised approach. Because what I usually say to the guys is, well, now 1,000 feet. Tell me what the stabilised approach criteria are. And they'll sort of and they'll say, well, it's got to be in the approach configuration, and there'll be some sort of discussion about whether the approach power needs to be set, and so on and so forth. But basically they're going to say, well, it needs to be stabilised. And then I'll say, well, yeah, okay, well, what does it need to be there, and why is it different from 1,000 feet? So at 500 feet, yes, the aeroplane's got to be fully established in the approach configuration and the approach power set, and the VREF not more than plus, can I hear it, plus 20, or the landing speed plus 20. And what I'll say, well, that's very good, but where do we find that? And we find it in two places, in the operations manual, one in flying crew orders, and one in the flying manual. And what I'll say to them then is, because we will have read it out together, and that's what I recommend you do just now, in other words, turn me off for a while, go read what it says, and I'm going to say, why do you think Colin is blind to that gate? And the reason is this, that if the aeroplane is not stable at 1,000 feet, but just within the parameters at 500 feet, can I be criticised? And the answer is yes, of course. And if I'm sitting alongside you and you do that, I will criticise you. If, however, I am unstable at 1,000 feet and I go round from that position, can I be criticised? Answer no, because I've done the right thing. And what is the feature about 1,000 feet that is different from 500 feet is that 1,000 feet is always cool. And I guess that, you know, from the time we flew the first aeroplane that had a retractable undercarriage, we have a last minute glance that we've got some greens, or however many greens you have on your aeroplane just before you land, as an instinctive, almost instinctive check. At 1,000 feet, which is a 1,000-foot call, I have an instinctive check. Am I stable? So my last port of call, and what I would say for a prudent captain, his last port of call, and notice I am saying last, is at 1,000 feet. A stable aeroplane check. And I think the interesting thing, and what I'd like to share with you, is aspects that, if you like, I uncovered or came to appreciate when I was dealing with people who had got to take, or the aeroplane had taken them to places they never ever expected or wanted to go. Those people who were subject of, or part of, a high-speed, unstable approach, and who didn't go round from it. And I think that there are a number of issues here that are worthy of thinking about. Now, this gives me another hook, because I want to propose to you that the most important part of your development of flying as a commander is not actually done in the aeroplane. It's done, as I would describe, in the bath, or when you're driving to the airport with the radio turned down and you're thinking about flying, or aspects of flying, and you're thinking about strategies that you can use, or ways in which you can practice briefings, let's say passenger briefings or whatever. Because those strategies, those subroutines, form a very, very important part of the disciplines that we bring to the safe and efficient operation of aircraft. So the interesting thing is that the 1,000-foot check, if you like, my last chance saloon for stability, is never an issue. Why? Because I'm not really interested in that guy. I am interested in somewhere way back up the approach, where I am able to determine how close I am to what I would call bear country. Now, if I stick with the 747 for a moment and go back to classic days, what we used to do as part of the conversion course was we would put the aeroplane at 250 tons, 250 knots, 35 miles out from a sea level airport, and say, what we'd like you to do is to fly the approach with idle power set, and we would like you to start running the flaps at 21 miles, but to run it precisely on the recommended speed schedule, which for the 747 was you run the flaps to 1 when you're at the up bug plus 10. And to put the wheels down, gear down at 2,500 feet. And if we did that, where do you think the power came on? The power came on between 1,000 and 1,500 feet. In other words, for a standard airplane on a standard day at sea level, starting an approach at 35 miles in still air meant that the energy that you had was right on the edge of bear country, so that the power went on between 1,000 and 1,500 feet. Now, we then, in fact, in the flying manual said that the balance, as always, between an unhurried approach and a fuel efficient approach needed to be created. And we put in the flying manual, for the life of me, although I've tried to get it in, I don't know why it's not in the 400 manual. But nevertheless, and it doesn't really matter, I'm going to withdraw that. The important thing is that in the Classic we said that at 20 miles you should be 6,000 feet above the airfield with the flaps at 5. And that is the gate which I have used all of the time that I have been flying a 747. And the reason is this, because once you've got the flaps to 5, you will have a hugely flexible aeroplane. Until you've got the flaps to 5, the aeroplane can be extremely slippery and it can be extremely difficult to get under control if you're high on the glide path. And at 20 miles, if the flaps are at 5, I am miles away from bear country. I've got huge flexibility. And the interesting thing is that at London, we don't get high-speed unstable approaches unless you're at the very early morning or very late at night when there's no speed control. Why? Because, funnily enough, Bovingdon, Lamble and Biggin are all around about 20 miles to run, and you need the flaps to be either 1 or running to 5. In other words, London has created gates which, in other parts of the world, they're not there. Now, when you talk to the guys that have got into the position where they're never expected to be, where, because I've yet to meet, a single pilot who got up in the morning and said, I think I'm going to do a rush approach today. The converse is absolutely true of our profession. Everybody gets up in the morning to do the best they possibly can. And when it goes wrong, it usually goes wrong because they have not got, if you like, the indicators that sit up here or are in neon lights to say you're going too close to the edge, Colin. Pull back, pull back. Stabilised approach procedures for me, last chance saloon, never get that. Why? Because I am working always to get myself in a position where I've got the flaps 5, 20 miles out, 6,000 feet above the ground. If I'm there or thereabouts, I am completely in control. And if I'm not, I've got loads of time to say I need an orbit, or I need extra miles, or to do whatever's necessary. Drop the gear, it's got to go down before we land anyway. In other words, what I have done in that is I have made space for myself. I have been selfish with space, selfish with time. I've given myself thinking time in order to make sure that I never get compromised on a stabilised approach. Selfish with time and space. Let me take you into Miami. Miami, landing east. What they're going to do is they're going to drive you high speed downwind, and they're going to say, can you see the airport? Can you see the airport? And say yes, clear visual approach. And away you go. Get screwed. Why does it get screwed? Because they've taken you out of a comfort zone. I want you to think about the fact that you are in charge of your aeroplane. British Airways has commissioned you as commander to keep the aeroplane right within the middle of our standard operating procedures, if you like, the middle of the envelope. And that means to say that if I'm going into Miami, I will say, no, I don't want a visual approach, I want an instrument approach, like an ILS on 8 left, or whatever, I can't remember off the top of my head. So you can't have that speed run. I say, okay, I'll take a VOR DME approach on the other runway. And when I'm on a VOR DME approach, which means to say that they have provided me with the S-bit of ATS, Air Traffic Control Service. Right? They have been watching my approach in order to bring me onto a reasonable intercept at a reasonable distance for the aeroplane that I have. Right? And the chances are they say, can you see the airport? I'll say yes. They say, okay, you're cleared for the ILS, or you're cleared for a visual approach, which was actually the ILS that I originally asked for. It always used to be a source of amusement to me in that you needed, in the AIS for San Francisco, beware, they will try and slam dunk you. Well, they'll never slam dunk me. And I hope they'll never slam dunk you. Why? Because you know you're going to go over San Francisco at 10,000 feet. And they'll say, at that point, clear on to a heading, expect a visual approach. And I will say, no thanks. I require an ILS. And whilst I am at the same time configuring the aeroplane to get it slow, full speed brake, get it down, nevertheless, by saying I require an ILS, puts them on notice that they have to provide me with a service to watch my rate of descent, to bring me onto the extended central line at a reasonable altitude so that I can drive an ILS. Now, in no way am I suggesting that we're going to hold up millions of people behind us because we're going to slow up to 180 knots, you know, at 30 miles. What I am saying is that I am not going to be pushed into a position where my approach is unstable. And that is because I've got a gate clearly defined which keeps me well away from bear country. Well away from bear country, and enables me sufficient thinking time to correct the problem if it's going wrong, because sometimes things get thrown at you off left base, and if it happens when you've got thinking time, you can deal with it. If it doesn't happen when you've got or if it happens when you haven't got thinking time, usually disaster strikes, because you know, as well as I do, that as soon as the pressure comes on, as soon as you start getting stressed, your ability to think broadly, your ability to monitor broadly diminishes. And in fact, what happens is that not only do you tunnel vision, you tunnel think. And if there's a runway ahead, the chances are you'll land on it, even if it's unsafe to do so. Now, I am not suggesting, and I will not suggest for a moment, that my gate should be your gate. But I want you to at least consider, for your aircraft type, the position in space that will give you sufficient thinking time to recognise that things are going wrong. And it sure as hell isn't 1,000 feet, and it will never be 500 feet. Because by then, shit happens. Hello again. At this point in the day, we've normally returned from coffee and we're raring to go with a technical review. Now, as I mentioned at the outset, this is designed around the 747-400, but those of you on a different fleet, please don't go to sleep, because actually I'm just using these examples to draw threads so that I can illustrate some issues around the way in which we approach the technical operation of our aeroplane and how we handle abnormalities and emergencies. So, to start with, I usually draw up here a replica of a PFD, primary flight display, and I'd say to the guys, what's on this side? And they say an altitude tape. Jolly good. And I say, on that altitude tape up here, we've got some red boxes. And what do they mean? Well, of course, they mean the maximum speed. And of course, where those boxes come from depends on what phase of flight you're in. So if we were in cruise, they would be from the air data computer, telling us the VMO or the MMO as appropriate. If we had the gear down, then those boxes would be saying the maximum speed for the gear, and if we had the flaps down, similarly for each phase of flap, they would be saying the maximum speed for the flaps, so coming off the flap control units or computer. So they're the top red boxes, and of course we've got some bottom red boxes down here. What are they? Well, of course they are the minimum speed, if you like, we can fly at, because these guys come off the stall warning computer. And the stall warning computer, of course, is making its calculations based on essentially the angle of attack of the aircraft, but giving us an instantaneous picture of the minimum speed that the airplane will continue to fly. Okay, well, in addition, we've got, I'll use, if I may, I'll use green, for which is amber. We have a thing up here called a hockey stick, which is in amber, which, for those of you on a 777, you've never seen before up there probably, and indeed that may be true of the Airbus as well. But basically this guy is what is best described as margin to high-speed flight. In other words, it's saying if you encroach within that area, you are reducing the margin between the aircraft and its high-speed buffet. Margin to high-speed buffet. And, no surprise, it's a calculation that the flight management computer does based on the aircraft weight, the altitude, and indeed the C of G. And it's making a calculation saying when is the shock wave going to break the air off the wing and give us a high-speed buffet. And here again in amber, also generally from the FMC but other places as well, comes a calculation of the low-speed buffet. In other words, the margin to low-speed buffet, which in the United Kingdom is set as 1.3 VS. 1.3 VS because that came from the old BCARs, which are British Civil Airworthiness Requirements, back in days of yours before the Joint Airworthiness Regulations, and is different to the American margin, which is actually 1.2 VS. So our margin to low speed buffet is actually set higher than, or with a greater margin than, the American system, in fact the American box. Now, if you imagine the flight management computer on the VNAV page, so again we'll draw it here on the VNAV page in cruise, there is a max altitude line and an optimum altitude line. So, if we flew our aeroplane at the maximum altitude line, tell me what would happen to those hockey sticks. And of course the answer is, as you rightly say, they will touch. And that is because at the maximum there is no margin between the aircraft speed encroaching low speed buffet margin and the aircraft encroaching high speed buffet margin. And it is a maximum that is derived, as I say, from the FMC, from the current centre of gravity of the aircraft, given its weight and the altitude. So, the question I asked the group is, we're going out of Johannesburg and the air traffic controller said you can have either 240 or 350. But when we look into our box here, the maximum altitude says 330, let's say. And I asked the group, well, how many people would go and accept flight level 350? And how many will accept 240? And there's usually a spattering of the two. And we're just going to go into that because basically that maximum is absolutely hard. Why? Well, the ops manual says so, that's one thing. So anybody who wanted to go 350 was going to operate outside the standard operating procedures of British Airways. But much more to the point, if you understand what it's doing, then clearly it's a hard maximum because you've got no margin whatever for going either faster or slower without encroaching one or other of the high speed buffet or low speed buffet margins. So a maximum altitude, given that you have put in the correct C of G, is a hard maximum altitude. Absolutely hard. Cobalt, chromium, steel hard. Because if you go above that, you are already in bandit country. So, the important thing probably to add on as a little addendum here is that because you will know perhaps that the maximum altitude will increase as you put the actual C of G in, because on the 747-400 it defaults to 8.5 as a CG. And the reason it defaults there is because it's right on the edge of the permitted trim range of the aircraft. So it gives you the worst position that you can be in, and then when you put the actual CG in, which we know is around about 21% on the 740, then it will move the maximum altitude up, because of course the aeroplane is positioned differently in the sky, and therefore the shock wave will occur at a slightly higher altitude than it will do at 8.5%. Okay, so why have I got here? Well, I've got here because I want to talk about stalling. So, before we get into stalling, what I generally do is ask the question, given that you are here, or thereabouts, let's give ourselves a little bit of gap between the high speed margin and the low speed margin. If you were going to be offered a speed discrepancy or speed deviation, would you prefer to be fast or slow? The group will mumble, and some will say fast and others will say slow. And so I will say what area I'd like to be in. If I'm going to have a speed deviation, I want to be fast. And the reason is that on this aeroplane, and indeed the 777-2, can't speak about the Airbus confidently, the aeroplane is very speed stable, fast. On air tests on the 400, from memory we take it to 9.6. Don't quote me on that, and I haven't got the air test schedule to hand. But it's fast. And anyway, if you prefer it, you will perhaps recall a China Airlines 747 that went supersonic. In fact, that was the cause of the bank angle being put on the GPWS computer, because it was a classic 747 freighter, And at night, it put on a gentle bank that the guys didn't see. It got to that position, and in the pull-out, it went fully supersonic. Now, they broke the aeroplane, they broke the main spar, but they all survived. Contrast that with going slow, and that's what we're going to talk about next. So, let's just imagine ourselves in an aeroplane that is clean, flying along, and for some reason or other the aircraft slows. The question is, as it slows, what will we get first? With a clean aeroplane, will we get low speed buffet first and then stick shake, or stick shake first and then buffet? Why should you know? Well, I shall tell you. With the aeroplane clean, you will always get buffet first, followed by stick shake. And conversely, with the aircraft dirty, in other words, with any flap out, whatever, you will always get stick shake first, followed by airframe buffet. So the first question I have in my mind is, well, if I'm up here and I have a speed deviation so that I get a buffet, will I know whether it's high speed buffet or low speed buffet? And of course I can look at the speed and make a judgment, but the real issue is it isn't going to feel any different. Why? Because on the one hand you're getting low speed buffet because of the break away from the wing, and on a high speed buffet you're getting buffet for the break away from the wing, not because of the angle of attack, but because there's a shock wave there. Same thing, you're going to feel it one way or another. But if we think about the aeroplane slowing, nice and steadily, slowing, what's the first thing we're going to get? Well, when the aeroplane gets to, funnily enough, 1.2 VS, because it's an American aeroplane, American built aeroplane with American equipment on it, 1.2 VS, you will get on the ICAS airspeed low, and that's a caution. So the first warning that you will get in steady flight slowing down, and if I can just keep us in the mid-levels now, let's say at 15,000 feet, the first thing that will come is airspeed low. Caution, airspeed low, 1.2 VS. It's below the top of the hockey stick, but nevertheless it's well above the stall. With a clean aeroplane, the next thing we're going to get is airframe buffet. And I want to talk a little bit about airframe buffet, if I may, because the simulators are designed so that they give you the indications of the approach to the stall. What they do not do in any stretch of the imagination is give you an idea of what the stall feels like. And on the 747 Classic, years ago, on air test, we used to have to stall the beast. And I can say that I've been very, very rarely frightened in an aeroplane ever. But that's one of the occasions when I got frightened for real on regular occasions. Because I tell you this, when you take the aeroplane to the stall, and we used to have to do it initially towards the stall with the aeroplane clean, it felt as though it was shaking itself to bits. The engines used to describe circles on the pylons. And the most conventional stall was actually done with the flaps at 10, and I tell you, it was vicious. Absolutely vicious. There's no doubt about the fact that you are approaching the stall on this aircraft because you get eyeball bounce, that you're being shaken so much. And the simulator doesn't do that for you, happily. So we have said, in the normal course of events, slowing up, we're going to see airspeed low, caution on the ICAS. We're now going to get some airframe buffet, and as we slow, we're going to get, at that point there, the top of the red boxes, we are going to get a stick shake. And as of the moment, we are in an approach to stall. and I think it's very, very important for us to review, that the approach to stall is an in-control, recoverable manoeuvre, as against a full stall, which is an out-of-control, but recoverable manoeuvre. The approach to stall is an in-control, recoverable manoeuvre. The actual stall is an out-of-control, recoverable manoeuvre. Okay. So, at this point I say, right guys, what is the recovery procedure? And there'll be general muttering, and I will choose someone and I say, tell me precisely, what are you going to do? And with a bit of luck, he will say, I'm going to shout, stall recovery. I'm going to open the thrust levers and disconnect the autopilot, disconnect the auto throttle, and I'm going to put the speed brake down and leave the automatics to do its thing. And I would say, well, that's very good. And we'll look at it in the QRH and we'll check that we got it right. And then I'm going to say, well, will that work for all levels? And there's no reason for any reason that, other than people who have been trainers in the simulator, that they would think otherwise. And the real worry is that that may not be an appropriate procedure if you're at the upper levels. And that is what I'd like to talk about next.